Hannah Brooks had spent nearly 20 years building the art gallery of her dreams, only to watch it disappear, piece by piece, until she lost everything that had once defined her life. At 41, she no longer owned the gallery. Her apartment was gone, and nearly every painting she had fought to protect had been sold just to pay her debts. With little more than a few $100s left and nowhere else to begin again, she made a decision that sounded completely absurd. Instead of buying furniture or looking for another job in the city, she drove to a forgotten little town and spent her last $300 on an old pottery kiln that everyone else believed belonged in a scrapyard. The auctioneer laughed as he handed her the receipt. The small crowd shook their heads, convinced the exhausted former gallery owner had finally lost what little judgment she had left. But only a few weeks later, while cleaning years of hardened clay from the kiln's cracked foundation, Hannah heard a hollow sound that shouldn't have been there. Hidden beneath the old bricks was a sealed compartment that had remained untouched for generations. And inside was something that had the power to rewrite the artistic history of an entire town. But before we uncover what Hannah found inside that forgotten kiln, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. Leave a comment below so I can welcome you to our wonderful storytelling community. If you're just starting your day, I hope it's filled with peace, good health, and unexpected moments of joy. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories about forgotten history, hidden family legacies, and ordinary people discovering extraordinary truths, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next unforgettable journey. Now, let's go back to the day Hannah spent her last $300 on the old pottery kiln that everyone else believed was completely worthless. Hannah Brooks stood alone in the center of her empty art gallery, listening to the unfamiliar sound of her own footsteps echo across the polished wooden floor. Only a month earlier, the room had been filled with visitors studying paintings beneath warm lights while quiet conversations drifted through the space. Now the walls were bare except for pale rectangles where framed artwork had once hung. Wooden crates lined the entrance, each carrying the last pieces sold to settle debts she could no longer outrun. At 41, Hannah had lost the business she had spent nearly 2 decades building. Rising rent, declining sales, and one disastrous investment had slowly pushed the gallery beyond saving. She had fought for another year, borrowing against her savings, organizing community exhibitions, and even selling part of her personal collection, believing the next month might somehow be different. It never was. The bank finally refused another extension. The landlord wanted the building back, and the gallery that had once been her greatest achievement quietly disappeared without ceremony. Friends encouraged her to start again in another city, but Hannah no longer had the strength to repeat the same struggle. She packed only what could fit inside her aging station wagon: several boxes of books, a suitcase of clothes, a toolbox inherited from her father, and a small notebook filled with sketches she had never found time to finish. After paying the last outstanding bills, she counted the remaining cash in her wallet. $362. It was unchronological, reach somewhere new if she spent almost nothing along the way. For several days, she drove without any real destination, leaving behind highways crowded with traffic until buildings gave way to farmland and quiet hills. She stopped wherever fuel was cheapest and slept one night inside her car, convincing herself that uncertainty was still better than returning to a life that had already ended. On the third afternoon, she reached the small town of Red Hollow, a place she had noticed only because a handwritten sign advertised a community auction. Curious more than hopeful, she parked beside a weathered barn, where local residents had gathered around rows of old furniture, farm tools, and forgotten equipment. The atmosphere felt friendly in the easy way that small towns often did. People greeted one another by name, while children wandered between tables filled with dusty household items. Hannah almost turned around, reminding herself she had no money for unnecessary purchases. But something at the far end of the yard caught her attention. Resting beneath a torn canvas stood an old pottery kiln. Its once white brick exterior had darkened with soot and age. Rust covered the metal bands that held the structure together, and one side leaned slightly, as though it had settled into the earth after years of neglect. Most bidders walked past without slowing down. Hannah approached it anyway. She brushed dirt from the manufacturer's plate, though time had erased nearly every letter. She ran her hand across the cracked bricks with unexpected familiarity. Years earlier, before opening her gallery, she had taken evening pottery classes simply because she loved watching ordinary clay transformed by fire into something lasting. Looking at the abandoned kiln reminded her of those evenings before business plans and financial worries had consumed every hour of her life. "Nobody wants that old thing," a cheerful voice said behind her. Hannah turned to find an older man wearing suspenders and a faded work shirt. "Been sitting in storage for decades," he continued. "Name's Eli Turner. I helped bring it here this morning." Hannah smiled politely. "Does it still work?" Eli chuckled. "Couldn't honestly tell you. Might not. Most folks think it's only worth the scrap metal." The auction began moving toward the final items. One by one they sold for modest prices until the auctioneer reached the pottery kiln. "We'll start at $300. Silence answered him. The auctioneer looked around with an amused expression before lowering his voice. "Any interest?" Hannah surprised herself by raising her hand. "300? A few people glanced toward her before exchanging puzzled smiles. Someone near the back laughed quietly. "City lady's buying a broken oven?" Another man shook his head. "She'd have been better off buying the pickup truck." Even the auctioneer smiled as he struck the wooden block. "Sold!" Eli handed Hannah an old iron key attached to a worn leather tag. "It's yours now," he said. "Hope it gives you better luck than it gave its last owner." Hannah thanked him, though she had no idea how she would even move the kiln. Eli solved that problem by offering the use of his flatbed trailer, explaining that he had no plans for the afternoon. Together, they transported the heavy kiln to an abandoned workshop on the edge of town that Hannah had rented cheaply after hearing the owner only wanted someone to keep the building occupied. The workshop smelled of old timber and clay dust, but its roof held firm and sunlight poured through wide windows. It was far from elegant, yet it felt strangely comforting. After Eli left, Hannah spent the remainder of the afternoon sweeping the floor, clearing broken shelves, and making enough space around the kiln to examine it properly. Layers of hardened clay clung to the lower bricks, making it difficult to see the original foundation. She fetched a wire brush and began cleaning away decades of packed debris. The work was slow, and several bricks shifted slightly beneath the pressure. As the final light of day slipped through the workshop windows, Hannah crouched beside the kiln and tapped one loosened section with the wooden handle of her brush. Instead of the solid sound she expected, a low, hollow echo answered from somewhere beneath the base. She froze, tapped again, and heard the same unmistakable sound rising from inside the foundation. Hannah barely slept that night. Long after darkness settled over Red Hollow, the hollow sound beneath the pottery kiln echoed through her thoughts. She had tapped the same brick at least a dozen times before locking the workshop and returning to the tiny room she had rented above the town's old grocery store. Every logical explanation crossed her mind. Perhaps the foundation had cracked. Perhaps rodents had tunneled beneath it. Perhaps years of settling had created an empty pocket under the bricks. Yet none of those possibilities sounded quite right. By sunrise, she was already unlocking the workshop door with a cup of coffee balanced in one hand and her father's old toolbox in the other. Morning light streamed through the dusty windows, falling across the kiln exactly where she had left it. Hannah knelt beside the foundation and tapped the brick again. The same deep, hollow echo answered. This time she listened more carefully, moving the handle of the hammer from one section to another. Most of the base sounded solid, but one corner produced a noticeably different tone. She brushed away more hardened clay until the outline of several carefully fitted bricks became visible. They did not match the surrounding masonry. Someone had rebuilt that corner long after the kiln had originally been constructed. Hannah examined the mortar. Unlike the older sections that had crumbled with age, this patch remained surprisingly smooth beneath decades of dust. Whoever repaired it had intended the work to blend in, but the careful pattern only made it stand out once the clay was removed. She reached for a small chisel from her toolbox and gently worked at the edge of one brick. It refused to move. After several careful attempts, she leaned back, realizing the kiln was far too heavy for one person to dismantle safely. For a moment, she considered giving up until she could afford professional help. But she had almost no money left. Hiring someone simply was not possible. Remembering the kindness Eli Turner had shown the previous day, Hannah walked into town, hoping to ask if he knew someone with experience repairing old kilns. She found his antique shop just after it opened. Bells chimed softly as she stepped inside. Shelves overflowed with vintage lamps, weathered clocks, handmade quilts, and worn pottery that had survived generations of use. Eli looked up from polishing an old coffee grinder and smiled. "Morning. I had a feeling you'd be back." Hannah laughed. "Is it that obvious? Most people who buy something unusual return with questions." She explained what she had discovered beneath the kiln. Eli listened without interrupting, though his expression gradually shifted from casual interest to quiet curiosity. "You'll want Luke Dawson," he finally said. "Best potter in town, repairs old kilns, builds new ones, fixes about anything made from brick or clay." "Would he help?" "Depends," Eli grinned. "He doesn't trust strangers very quickly, but he respects honest work." 20 minutes later, Hannah found Luke behind a modest pottery studio on the edge of town. He was unloading freshly fired bowls from a modern kiln when she introduced herself. He recognized her almost immediately. "You're the woman who bought that old wreck at the auction." "I am." "Still think it was a bargain?" There was amusement in his voice, but not cruelty. Hannah smiled. "I'm beginning to wonder." She described the hollow foundation and the unusual brickwork. Luke crossed his arms thoughtfully. "If someone's hidden something under there, forcing it open could damage both the kiln and whatever's inside. Would you take a look?" He hesitated only briefly before wiping clay from his hands. "All right." Back at the workshop, Luke circled the kiln several times, crouching occasionally to inspect the repaired section. He tapped the bricks with a small wooden mallet from his own tool bag, listening carefully before nodding. "You're right," he admitted. "That's not natural settling." "Can we open it?" Carefully, they spread heavy blankets around the base before removing loose debris. Luke explained each step as they worked, making sure the kiln's weight remained balanced while individual bricks were loosened one at a time. The process took nearly 2 hours. Sweat collected across Hannah's forehead despite the cool morning air. Several bricks refused to move until Luke patiently chipped away the old mortar surrounding them. Finally, one brick slid free. Behind it appeared darkness. Hannah held her flashlight close while Luke removed 2 more bricks, creating an opening large enough to peer inside. The beam illuminated a narrow chamber hidden beneath the kiln floor. Dust floated through the air as though it had remained undisturbed for decades. Resting inside were several small wooden crates wrapped tightly in faded oilcloth. They had been stacked with remarkable care, protected from moisture by the sealed compartment surrounding them. Hannah stared in disbelief. Someone built this on purpose? Luke nodded slowly. No accident. They enlarged the opening just enough to lift the first crate through the gap. Despite its modest size, it felt surprisingly heavy. Years of dust coated the oilcloth, but the wrapping itself remained intact. Hannah gently brushed away the dirt, while Luke examined the wooden lid. There's something carved here. He wiped the surface clean with a rag. An unfamiliar symbol slowly appeared beneath the dust. A simple circle enclosing a stylized clay vessel surrounded by 3 small stars. The design looked handmade rather than commercial. Neither of them recognized it. "Have you ever seen that before?" Hannah asked. Luke shook his head. "Never." At that moment, the workshop door creaked open. Eli stepped inside carrying a paper bag. "Thought you two might need lunch," he called before noticing the open compartment beneath the kiln. His smile disappeared instantly. He walked toward the workbench without taking his eyes off the carved symbol. The paper bag slipped slightly in his hands. "Where did you find this?" he asked quietly. Hannah pointed toward the hidden chamber. Eli reached out, but stopped short of touching the crate. For several long seconds, he simply stared at the symbol. "I haven't seen that mark since I was a little boy," he murmured. "My grandfather showed it to me once. He told me never to forget it, though he refused to explain what it meant." Hannah and Luke exchanged puzzled glances. "Do you know who used it?" Hannah asked. Eli slowly shook his head. "Only that the older folks always spoke about it in whispers." Silence settled across the workshop as Hannah untied the faded oilcloth, lifted the weathered wooden lid, and slowly opened the first crate. The wooden lid creaked softly as Hannah lifted it away. For a moment, no one spoke. Inside, carefully packed in layers of faded linen, rested half a dozen handmade pottery pieces unlike anything Hannah had ever seen. Each bowl, pitcher, and vase had been separated by folded cloth to protect it from damage. Despite the years hidden beneath the kiln, every piece remained remarkably intact. The glazed surfaces reflected the morning light with deep shades of blue, cream, and rich earth tones. Delicate patterns of wildflowers, rivers, and rolling hills had been painted by hand with extraordinary precision. Hannah gently lifted the smallest bowl from the crate, supporting it with both hands as though it might disappear if she breathed too hard. "These aren't ordinary workshop pieces," she whispered. Luke leaned closer. "No." His voice carried quiet admiration. "Whoever made these knew exactly what they were doing." Eli removed his hat as he looked into the crate. "I've lived here all my life," he said softly, "and I've never seen pottery like this." Hannah carefully turned the bowl over. The same symbol carved onto the crate had been pressed into the clay before firing a simple vessel surrounded by 3 stars enclosed within a circle. Beneath it appeared a neatly written number. "Number 7, Hannah read. Luke examined another vase. "This one's marked 14. One by one, they removed the remaining pieces until the crate stood empty. Every item carried a different number, but the same mysterious emblem. Hannah spread them across the workbench with growing excitement. None showed signs of careless production. Every brushstroke reflected patience, confidence, and remarkable artistic skill. The collection looked less like commercial pottery and more like work prepared for an exhibition. Beneath the folded linen at the bottom of the crate, Hannah discovered another layer. She carefully lifted it aside. A leather-bound notebook rested underneath beside several rolled sheets of yellowed paper tied together with faded ribbon. The leather had dried with age but remained surprisingly well preserved. Hannah loosened the strap and opened the notebook. The first page contained a handwritten title, Workshop Register. Below it appeared the same familiar symbol. Luke stepped closer. "Looks like a record book." Hannah turned the next page. Neatly organized entries listed pottery pieces beside measurements, glaze descriptions, firing temperatures, and short handwritten notes. Each finished item had been carefully documented. Whoever owned this kept excellent records, she observed. Tucked between two pages, she found a folded sketch showing the outline of a tall decorative vase, with handwritten color notes around the edges. Additional pages contained drawings of bowls, pitchers, serving plates, and decorative tiles. Every design matched the craftsmanship resting on the workbench. Eli slowly shook his head. None of this ever reached the antique market around here. Hannah unrolled the larger papers next. They proved to be inventory lists. Every pottery piece received a catalog number matching the markings underneath the finished work. Columns identified shapes, glaze colors, and completion dates. Several pages included names written beside completed items. Hannah scanned them casually until one surname caused her hands to stop moving. Brooks. She looked again to make certain she had not imagined it. There it was, written clearly in dark ink beside 3 different entries. Eleanor Brooks. Hannah frowned. Brooks was her family name. It could have been coincidence. The surname was not uncommon. Still, something about seeing it inside records, hidden beneath a kiln she had purchased only days earlier, sent an unexpected chill through her. "Everything all right?" Luke asked. Hannah pointed silently at the page. "That's my last name." Eli adjusted his glasses and read the entry himself. "Interesting." Hannah continued turning pages. More names appeared, each repeated beside different pottery pieces. Then she found Brooks again. Another page, then another. Eleanor Brooks appeared throughout the register far more often than anyone else. Whoever she had been, she had clearly played an important role in creating the collection. Hannah searched her memory. Her grandmother had occasionally mentioned a great-grandmother named Eleanor who enjoyed making pottery, but little else had survived. Family stories had faded with each generation until only scattered memories remained. She had never imagined the name might appear inside a hidden archive. Luke watched her expression. Could she be related? I honestly don't know. Hannah smiled uneasily. I grew up hearing almost nothing about that side of the family. The deeper she read, the more often Eleanor Brooks appeared. Some entries listed her as the artist. Others credited her with supervising firing schedules or proving finished work. Hannah felt a growing connection she could not yet explain. The notebook continued for dozens of pages before suddenly changing. Near the back, several sheets had been removed, leaving rough edges where paper had once been stitched into the binding. Someone had deliberately cut them away. Hannah carefully turned to the final surviving page. At the bottom appeared one last entry. Eleanor Brooks. Unlike every previous page, however, this name had been crossed out with a thick line of dark red ink. The mark had been drawn with such force that it nearly tore through the paper. No explanation followed. No correction had been written beside it. The line simply erased her name while leaving it visible enough that anyone reading the register would know it had once been there. Hannah stared at the page in stunned silence. Luke frowned. That wasn't an accident. Eli nodded slowly. Someone wanted the name removed. Hannah touched the edge of the paper without disturbing the ink. But they didn't destroy the page. No, Eli replied quietly, almost like they wanted people to see that it had been erased. None of them could explain why. The missing pages only deepened the mystery. Hannah closed the notebook gently and looked toward the remaining unopened crates still resting beside the kiln. If the first crate contained this much history, she could hardly imagine what waited inside the others. Yet her attention kept returning to the final page of the register, where Eleanor Brooks's name remained trapped beneath that deliberate stroke of red ink. leaving one question echoing louder than the hollow chamber beneath the kiln itself. Why had someone gone to such careful effort to erase her from the story? The question followed Hannah home that evening and greeted her again the next morning. Why had Eleanor Brooks's name been carefully recorded throughout the workshop register, only to be crossed out in heavy red ink on the final surviving page? She spread the notebook across a sturdy table inside the workshop, comparing the handwriting on different entries. The red line had clearly been added later. The original ink had faded to a warm brown over time, while the red pigment remained darker and heavier, as though someone had returned long after the records were first written. Luke arrived carrying fresh coffee before beginning repairs on one of the workshop windows. He noticed Hannah studying the register again. "Still thinking about the name?" he asked. She nodded. "I can't stop." Whoever erased it wanted future readers to notice. Luke looked over the page once more.
If they only wanted to hide her, they could have torn the paper out like the missing pages. Exactly. Hannah closed the notebook gently. Instead, they left the evidence behind. Eli stopped by a little later with several padded blankets for storing the pottery safely. Before leaving, he suggested they speak with someone who knew more about Red Hollow's history than anyone else.
"Go see Martha Collins," he said. "She ran the town museum for nearly 30 years before retiring. If anyone recognizes that symbol or those records, it'll be Martha." The museum itself had closed several years earlier for renovation, leaving most of its collection in storage. But Martha still volunteered a few mornings each week to organize local archives. Hannah and Luke found her in a quiet brick building behind the old courthouse, surrounded by shelves filled with boxes, maps, and carefully labeled documents. Martha Collins welcomed them warmly despite their unexpected visit. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her head, and a pair of reading glasses rested low on her nose while she sorted photographs. "Eli called ahead," she said with a smile. "He told me you had found something unusual." Hannah carefully unwrapped one of the pottery bowls and placed it on the large reading table alongside the workshop register. Martha's expression changed almost immediately. She reached for cotton gloves before touching either item. "Where did this come from?" she asked quietly. Hannah briefly explained buying the old kiln, discovering the hidden chamber, and uncovering the crates beneath the foundation. Martha examined the symbol stamped beneath the bowl before opening the register. She turned several pages without speaking, occasionally stopping to study the handwriting. Finally, she looked up. "These are extraordinary." Hannah leaned forward. "Do you recognize them?" Martha nodded slowly. "Not the individual pieces, but I recognize the stories that were never fully told." She walked toward a nearby filing cabinet and removed a thin folder containing copies of newspaper articles, census records, and early town histories. Spreading them across the table, she pointed to a faded photograph of Red Hollow taken more than a century earlier. "Most official histories celebrate the merchants, businessmen, and landowners who helped establish the town," she explained. "But there are scattered references to workshops run by women who supplied pottery, tableware, and household goods during those same years." Hannah searched the articles. "They're barely mentioned." "Exactly," Martha smiled sadly. "The official records focused on the people who owned the businesses, not always the people who created the work." Luke compared one newspaper clipping with the pottery resting on the table. "None of these articles mention this symbol." "No," Martha agreed. "I've searched for years and never found an explanation." Hannah showed her the repeated entries for Eleanor Brooks and the final page where the name had been crossed out. Martha adjusted her glasses and studied it carefully. "That's remarkable. Have you ever heard of Eleanor Brooks?" Hannah asked. Martha thought for a long moment before answering. "Only once." Hannah's attention sharpened immediately. Martha opened another archival box and removed a handwritten catalog prepared decades earlier by an earlier museum volunteer. Her name appears in one inventory describing pottery donated to the museum many years ago, but when later curators reviewed the records, the reference disappeared. Hannah frowned. Disappeared? The object remained. The attribution did not. Luke exchanged a glance with Hannah. Another missing name, another unexplained change. Martha gently closed the register. History often grows complicated. Sometimes records are lost through neglect. Sometimes people simply repeat earlier mistakes without questioning them. Hannah remained thoughtful. And sometimes names are removed on purpose. Martha did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked once more at the crossed-out page before quietly nodding. As they packed the pottery for the trip back to the workshop, another visitor entered the archive building. He introduced himself as Richard Hale, chairman of the local historical foundation and one of the museum's largest financial supporters. Martha greeted him politely before explaining that Hannah had uncovered several remarkable pottery pieces in an old kiln purchased at auction. Richard listened with genuine interest while Hannah carefully uncovered one of the bowls. He examined the craftsmanship with obvious admiration. "These are beautiful," he said. "If the collection is as significant as Martha believes, it deserves proper preservation." Hannah agreed. "That's exactly what I'm hoping to do." Richard smiled pleasantly. "My foundation has the resources to conserve fragile collections. I'd be willing to purchase everything you found for a very generous price." Hannah looked down at the pottery resting between them. Only a week earlier, she would have accepted almost any offer simply to rebuild her life. But now the collection felt different. The crossed-out name, the careful records, and the hidden chamber beneath the kiln suggested that money was no longer the most important part of the story. She slowly shook her head. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't think I'm ready to sell." Richard remained courteous, though disappointment briefly crossed his face. "You should at least consider it. Collections like this require considerable care." "I understand." "Think about it," he replied. "There's no need to rush." Hannah thanked him, and for a moment the conversation seemed finished. Richard gathered his coat, then paused beside the doorway. Without changing his calm tone, he looked back toward Hannah. "One piece of friendly advice," he said. "Some old stories are best appreciated without digging too deeply into them." Hannah met his eyes. "Why would you say that?" Richard offered only a polite smile. "Because history sometimes becomes more complicated than people expect." With that, he quietly left the archive. The room remained silent for several seconds after the door closed. Martha slowly removed her glasses. Luke looked toward the entrance where Richard had disappeared. Hannah stood beside the wrapped pottery, hearing his final words echo in her thoughts. She had already decided not to sell the collection, but now another question had taken its place. Why would someone encourage her to stop searching before she had even learned the full story? Richard Hale's quiet warning lingered in Hannah's thoughts long after she and Luke left the archive building. It had not sounded like a threat. If anything, it carried the tone of someone convinced he was offering sensible advice. Yet the more she replayed his words, the more certain she became that abandoning the search would leave too many questions unanswered. That evening, she returned to the workshop and carefully unpacked the workshop register once again. The pottery remained safely wrapped in the blankets Eli had provided, while the notebook rested beneath a bright desk lamp. Luke joined her after closing his own studio, bringing sandwiches and fresh coffee without asking whether she needed either. "Thought you might forget to eat," he said with a grin. Hannah smiled. "You're beginning to know me too well." They spent the next several hours studying every surviving page. Hannah compared handwriting, page numbers, and ink colors, while Luke examined the physical construction of the notebook itself. It was he who finally noticed something unusual. "Look here," he said, gently turning the book toward the light. Tiny gaps remained along the binding where the missing pages had once been sewn into place. Hannah counted them carefully. "At least 6 pages are gone. Maybe more." The missing section fell directly between the detailed production records and the final page where Eleanor Brooks's name had been crossed out. Whatever information had once occupied those pages had been deliberately removed without damaging the rest of the register. Hannah sighed. Whoever did this knew exactly what they wanted to erase. Luke tapped one corner of the inside cover. Not everything disappeared. Faint pencil marks, barely visible beneath the leather, caught the light at a particular angle. Hannah adjusted the lamp and slowly traced the faded writing with her eyes. It was not a sentence. Instead, it looked like a reference code followed by a short abbreviation. Beneath it, someone had drawn the familiar symbol of the clay vessel, surrounded by 3 stars. Martha examined the notebook the following morning and immediately recognized the style of the notation. "This isn't part of the register," she explained. "It's an archive reference." Hannah looked up. "An archive where?" Martha considered the faded code. "Years ago, before the museum collection was reorganized. Historical documents were stored in the basement of the old museum building. Every storage cabinet had a location code." She smiled thoughtfully. "I believe this one refers to cabinet C7. The museum itself no longer occupied the old building. Most exhibits had been relocated years earlier, leaving only storage rooms that volunteers occasionally visited." Martha obtained permission from the caretaker, and by midday, the 3 of them stood inside the quiet basement, surrounded by rows of aging cabinets, shelves, and document boxes. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight, entering through high basement windows. Metal labels still marked each cabinet, though many had become difficult to read. After searching several rows, they finally located one labeled C7. Hannah opened the cabinet carefully. Most shelves contained ordinary town records, property maps, and faded correspondence. Nothing appeared connected to the pottery collection. "Maybe the files were moved," Luke suggested. Martha frowned. "Not necessarily." She crouched beside the lowest shelf and noticed small scratches along the wooden floor beneath the cabinet. "Help me slide this forward." Together they eased the heavy cabinet several inches away from the wall. Behind it, hidden from normal view, appeared a narrow recessed compartment built into the brick foundation. Inside rested a small metal lockbox covered in dust. Hannah's heartbeat quickened. Someone hid it. The box itself was unlocked. Hannah lifted the lid. Inside lay only a few carefully preserved items: several folded inventory cards, an old museum catalog, and a single sealed envelope tied with faded cotton ribbon. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, appeared 2 simple words: Eleanor Brooks. Hannah stared silently at the familiar name. Luke looked at Martha. "No one ever cataloged this?" Martha slowly shook her head. "Not that I've ever seen." Hannah picked up the envelope with both hands. The paper had yellowed with age, but the wax seal remained surprisingly intact. Pressed into the wax was the same symbol they had already found beneath the kiln and throughout the workshop: register. Beneath Eleanor's name, someone had written another short line: "To be opened only when the complete record is found." Hannah looked toward the cabinet behind them. "The complete record." Martha nodded thoughtfully. "Whoever left this expected someone to discover the rest first." Hannah glanced back toward the hidden envelope. The missing register pages, the erased name, the concealed pottery, and now a sealed letter waiting in an overlooked archive, all seemed connected by careful planning rather than chance. She wondered whether Eleanor herself had intended someone to follow this path many years later. Luke quietly broke the silence. Are you going to open it? Hannah held the envelope gently, feeling the slight stiffness of folded papers inside. Every discovery so far had answered one question while raising another. Richard had urged her not to continue, yet standing in the quiet basement with Eleanor Brooks's name resting in her hands, Hannah realized there was no turning back. She carefully slipped one finger beneath the faded ribbon, took a slow breath, and prepared to break the century-old seal. Hannah held the sealed envelope for several long seconds before carefully breaking the brittle wax. The paper inside had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained remarkably clear. Luke and Martha stood quietly beside her as she unfolded the first page. At the top appeared a simple date followed by a single signature: Eleanor Brooks. Hannah read silently at first, then slowly began reading aloud. Eleanor explained that she had chosen to let her own name disappear from the official record rather than allow the entire workshop to be forgotten. During the final years of the Pottery studio, several influential businessmen had agreed to finance a permanent public exhibition celebrating Red Hollow's craftsmanship. The women who created most of the pottery had been promised equal recognition. Instead, shortly before the exhibition opened, the records were revised. Ownership of the workshop remained with the businessmen, while the women who designed, shaped, glazed, and fired the pottery gradually disappeared from the official history. Eleanor wrote that she protested the changes but eventually accepted one painful compromise. If arguing publicly placed the entire collection at risk of being scattered or destroyed, she would allow her own name to be removed while quietly protecting the records proving who had truly created the work. "A name can be erased," she wrote, "but truth deserves a patient guardian." Hannah lowered the letter for a moment. The room remained silent except for the faint hum of an old dehumidifier. Martha gently wiped her glasses. She knew exactly what she was doing. Hannah nodded before continuing. Eleanor described hiding the pottery beneath the kiln because she believed future generations would judge the artists more fairly than her own time had. She also mentioned that not every record could fit inside the hidden chamber. Some documents had been separated intentionally and stored elsewhere, so that no single discovery could erase the entire history if one hiding place were found. Near the end of the letter, Eleanor referred to financial records connected to the canceled exhibition. "The accounts reveal what words alone cannot," she wrote. "Follow the numbers, and you will find the workshop that began it all." Hannah carefully folded the letter. The accounts. Martha immediately reached for the museum catalog that had been hidden inside the same lockbox. Several handwritten notes had been added along the margins by an unknown archivist many decades earlier. One notation matched the reference Eleanor had mentioned. Martha compared the catalog with several boxes of preserved municipal records stored nearby. After nearly an hour of searching, she located a thin ledger labeled simply "Exhibition Accounts." Dust covered the faded cover, suggesting no one had opened it in many years. Together they carried it to the reading table. Hannah turned the pages slowly. Payments for lumber, bricks, glazing materials, display cabinets, and transportation had all been recorded with remarkable precision. The figures appeared orderly until Martha paused halfway through the ledger. "These totals don't balance." Hannah looked closer. "What do you mean?" Martha pointed to two facing pages. "According to these entries, enough money was approved to build and furnish the exhibition hall." She turned another page, but the final expenses suddenly shrank by nearly half. Luke frowned. "Could someone have stolen the money?" Martha quietly shook her head. "Not according to the bank receipts attached here." She laid several receipts beside the ledger. Every withdrawal matched an authorized payment. The money wasn't missing. Hannah studied the figures again. Then why does the official summary show a completely different total? Martha traced several account numbers with her finger before looking up.
Because someone rewrote the final report, not the original bookkeeping. Hannah compared the handwritten receipts with the official summary attached at the back of the ledger. The totals had indeed been altered. Entire columns had been condensed into vague descriptions that no longer reflected the detailed accounts recorded earlier. Eleanor's words suddenly made more sense. The numbers themselves preserved a truth that later summaries had concealed. Luke leaned over the ledger. "Look at this." At the bottom of one payment receipt appeared the familiar symbol of the clay vessel surrounded by 3 stars. Beside it, someone had drawn a small map unlike anything they had seen before. The sketch showed only a few streets and one building marked with the same symbol. Hannah recognized the outline immediately from Martha's historical maps. "That's the original pottery workshop." Martha nodded. "The first one ever built in Red Hollow." A short handwritten instruction appeared beneath the drawing. The ring record waits where the first kiln cooled. Hannah felt both excitement and uncertainty. "Do you think that's where the missing documents are?" Martha carefully closed the ledger. "It's certainly where Eleanor wanted the next search to begin." Luke smiled faintly. "Looks like we're not finished yet." Hannah slipped Eleanor's letter back into its protective envelope before placing it beside the ledger. She looked once more at the small hand-drawn map. The abandoned workshop stood just outside town, long unused and absent from most modern maps. Yet someone had preserved its location with deliberate care for more than a century. Whatever remained there had survived every passing year, waiting for someone willing to follow the story all the way back to where it had begun. As they gathered the documents and prepared to leave the archive, Hannah folded the map into her notebook, knowing their next destination would be the forgotten pottery workshop where the earliest chapter of Eleanor Brooks's story still waited to be uncovered. The abandoned pottery workshop stood at the edge of Red Hollow, where the trees had slowly reclaimed what people no longer used. The weathered brick building leaned slightly beneath the weight of time, its broken windows covered by climbing vines and its wooden doors faded almost gray from decades of rain and summer heat. Hannah stood quietly for a moment, studying the place Eleanor Brooks had marked on her hand-drawn map. It did not look like the birthplace of an artistic legacy. It looked like a building the town had forgotten. Luke unlocked the rusted chain securing the front doors after receiving permission from the property owner earlier that morning. The hinges groaned as they pushed the entrance open. Cool air carrying the scent of old clay and damp timber drifted into the sunlight. Dust floated through long beams of light reaching the floor. Broken shelves lined one wall, while fragments of cracked pottery remained scattered near a collapsed work table. Martha entered slowly behind them, holding a flashlight and several copies of the historical maps. "This was once the busiest pottery workshop in the county," she said quietly. "Hard to imagine now." Hannah walked carefully across the uneven floor. Although the building had fallen into ruin, signs of careful craftsmanship still remained. Large drying racks stood against the far wall. Clay mixing barrels rested beneath cracked windows. An old brick kiln occupied the center of the workshop, much larger than the one Hannah had purchased at auction. "Everything started here," she murmured. Luke nodded. "You can almost picture people working in this room." Martha compared the layout with Eleanor's map until she reached a narrow storage room behind the kiln. "The drawing ends here." The room contained little more than broken crates and collapsed shelving. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Hannah carefully moved several empty boxes aside, while Luke swept away years of leaves that had blown through a broken window. Beneath the debris, they uncovered a heavy wooden chest tucked beneath one remaining shelf. Unlike the surrounding furniture, the chest showed little water damage. Thick layers of dust suggested no one had touched it in many decades. The lid was secured by a simple iron latch that had rusted almost completely through. Luke carefully lifted it open.
Inside rested several leather-bound ledgers wrapped in oilcloth, much like the crates hidden beneath Hannah's kiln. Hannah gently removed the top volume. Across its cover, pressed into the leather in faded gold lettering, appeared the words, Master Workshop Register. She exchanged a glance with Martha before opening the first page. Immediately they recognized the familiar symbol of the clay vessel surrounded by 3 stars. This register was older than the notebook recovered from beneath the kiln, yet its pages remained complete. Every artisan working in the workshop had been listed by name beside detailed records of completed pottery. Hannah slowly turned page after page. There was Eleanor Brooks, not merely appearing as an assistant or supervisor, but identified repeatedly as the artist responsible for many of the workshop's finest pieces. Beside her name appeared dozens of other women whose names had never appeared in the official histories Martha had collected. Each completed bowl, vase, pitcher, and serving plate had been assigned to its creator with careful accuracy. Luke smiled as he examined the entries. "This changes everything." Martha nodded. "It proves the collection belonged to the women who actually made it." Hannah continued reading. Production schedules, firing dates, glaze formulas, and individual commissions filled hundreds of carefully written pages. There was no sign of confusion or shared ownership. The records clearly documented exactly who designed and crafted each work. The official version of history had simply ignored them. Beneath the first ledger rested another volume labeled Workshop Exhibition Inventory. Hannah opened it carefully. Every pottery piece prepared for the canceled public exhibition had been listed in numerical order. Many of the catalog numbers matched those stamped beneath the pottery hidden inside the kiln she had purchased. Eleanor's collection had never been random. It had been assembled deliberately for public display before disappearing from history. Martha quietly closed her eyes for a moment. She really intended the town to know their names. Hannah gently touched one page listing nearly 20 artists together. And someone decided the town wouldn't. As they continued examining the records, Luke discovered a folded packet of official correspondence tucked inside the back cover. The papers documented meetings between the workshop committee and several civic leaders responsible for organizing the exhibition. Most letters focused on ordinary planning until one final document caught Hannah's attention. It contained approval signatures authorizing revisions to the exhibition catalog shortly before opening day. She read the names one by one. Most meant nothing to her. Then one signature near the bottom made Martha quietly inhale. "Harold Hale," Martha said softly. "Richard's father." Hannah looked up. "Are you certain?" Martha nodded. "He served on the Historical Advisory Committee for years." The signature did not accuse Harold Hale of destroying records or altering history himself. It simply confirmed that he had approved the final catalog revisions, replacing the original artist listings. Hannah carefully compared the correspondence with the workshop register lying beside it. The contrast could not have been clearer. One preserved the names of every woman who created the pottery. The other approved the official version that quietly removed them from public recognition. Luke leaned back against the old workbench. Richard wasn't wrong when he said history was complicated. Martha folded the correspondence carefully. Complicated doesn't mean impossible to correct. Hannah looked once more across the abandoned workshop. Eleanor Brooks had accepted losing her own place in history, so the evidence itself would survive. She had hidden pottery beneath one kiln, preserved records inside another workshop, and trusted that someone, someday, would piece the story back together. Hannah felt the weight of that trust more strongly than ever. She closed the register gently and placed it back inside the chest alongside the remaining volumes. Around her, the silent workshop no longer felt abandoned. It felt as though generations of forgotten artists had patiently waited for someone to open the records and speak their names again. As they prepared to carry the ledgers back to town for preservation, Hannah glanced once more at the correspondence bearing Harold Hale's unmistakable signature. Realizing that the next conversation she needed to have would be with the son of the man who had helped approve the history everyone had believed for decades, Hannah carried the restored workshop registers back to Red Hollow with greater care than she had shown any artwork during her years as a gallery owner. Every page represented more than history. It represented names that had patiently waited to be remembered. As she and Luke carefully placed the ledgers inside the temporary storage room Martha had arranged, neither of them spoke much. The discovery at the abandoned workshop had answered the question of who created the pottery, but it had also raised another that could no longer be ignored. Why had Harold Hale signed the revisions that erased those artists from public recognition? Richard Hale agreed to meet them the following afternoon in the reading room of the old archive building. He arrived carrying a worn leather briefcase instead of the confident smile Hannah had first seen when he offered to purchase the collection. Martha laid the original workshop register beside the revised exhibition catalog, while Hannah quietly placed the correspondence bearing Harold Hale's signature between them. Richard looked at the papers without touching them. He recognized his father's signature immediately. For several long moments, he remained silent. Finally, he removed his glasses and sighed. "I wondered if you would eventually find these." Hannah studied him carefully. "Then you knew they existed?" Richard nodded once. "Not all of them. My father told me there were records that didn't match the official history. He never showed me where they were kept." Martha folded her hands. "Did he explain why the names were removed?" Richard looked toward the workshop register lying open before him. Eleanor Brooks's name appeared clearly beside dozens of pottery pieces. He said the exhibition committee believed visitors would take the collection more seriously if it highlighted the businessmen who financed the workshop, instead of the women who created the pottery. Luke frowned. That wasn't recognition. That was replacement. Richard accepted the criticism without argument. "I know." His voice had lost the confidence Hannah remembered from their first meeting. "My father didn't create that decision alone, but he admitted that he signed the final catalog revisions because he believed preserving the exhibition mattered more than arguing over the names." Hannah quietly shook her head. "Those names were the story." Richard nodded slowly. "I understand now." He opened his briefcase and removed a thin folder of personal papers. Inside rested several handwritten notes belonging to Harold Hale. One passage had been underlined years earlier. Richard slid it across the table for the others to read. Harold had written that he regretted approving the revised catalog, but convinced himself that preserving the pottery itself was better than risking the exhibition being canceled entirely. As the years passed, correcting the mistake became harder. New museum displays repeated the shortened history until eventually most people accepted it as fact. "He always intended to fix it," Richard said quietly. "He simply waited too long." Martha carefully returned the note. "History has a way of becoming heavier the longer we postpone telling the truth." Richard looked directly at Hannah. "When you refused to sell the collection, I realized you were searching for something more important than its value. That's why I warned you not to dig deeper." Hannah remembered his calm words in the archive. "You thought the truth would divide the town." "Yes." He gave a faint, tired smile. "Instead, I think hiding it any longer would do far more damage." The conversation continued for nearly an hour as they compared Harold's personal notes with the recovered workshop registers and Eleanor's letter. None of the evidence suggested a conspiracy or malicious plot. Instead, it revealed a series of decisions made by people who believed they were protecting the town's reputation while quietly sacrificing the recognition owed to the women who built its artistic tradition. That realization did not erase the injustice, but it made the story painfully human. Before leaving, Richard closed his briefcase and looked once more at the pottery displayed on the table. "I'd like to help make this right," he said. Hannah hesitated briefly before answering.
Then help us tell the complete story.
Richard nodded. I will. Over the following days, Hannah, Martha, and Luke worked together to organize the recovered records. Every pottery piece received its original catalog number again. Every artist's name from the workshop register was matched to the surviving collection wherever possible. Martha prepared historical summaries supported entirely by the recovered documents, refusing to speculate beyond what the evidence clearly proved. Luke built simple wooden display stands inside Hannah's workshop, while Eli carefully cleaned several glass display cases that had been stored in his antique shop for years. The project slowly transformed from a private investigation into something the entire town would soon see. Word spread quickly through Red Hollow. Some residents became excited after hearing that forgotten local artists had finally been identified. Others remained skeptical. Several longtime families questioned whether old records should change a version of history they had grown up believing. Hannah understood their uncertainty. The discoveries challenged familiar stories, and change rarely arrived without discomfort. Still, every document she held had survived because someone believed the truth would matter one day. She could not ignore that trust now. One evening, after arranging another group of pottery pieces beneath soft display lights, Hannah stepped back to look across the workshop. The room that had once stood empty now held shelves filled with restored pottery, carefully labeled photographs, copies of workshop registers, and Eleanor Brooks's letter preserved inside a protective case. Luke joined her, carrying the final display board. "Ready?" he asked. Hannah smiled, though nervousness still lingered beneath her excitement. "As ready as I can be." Together, they hung a simple sign near the entrance, announcing a public exhibition for the following weekend. Beneath the title appeared one sentence: Rediscovering the Artists Who Shaped Red Hollow. By the next morning, people had already begun stopping outside to read the announcement. Some smiled with curiosity. Others quietly walked away without comment. Hannah watched from the workshop window, knowing that once the doors opened, the conversation about Red Hollow's history would belong to the entire community, whether everyone welcomed it or not. The morning of the exhibition arrived with a mixture of excitement and quiet uncertainty. Hannah unlocked the workshop before sunrise, switching on the display lights one by one until the restored pottery glowed softly beneath the glass cases. Every piece rested beside its original catalog number recovered from the workshop registers. Beneath each object appeared the name of the woman who had shaped it more than a century earlier. Eleanor Brooks's work occupied the center display, surrounded by copies of the original register pages, proving her role as both artist and workshop supervisor. Along one wall, Martha had arranged enlarged photographs, historical timelines, and carefully reproduced documents that explained how the official records had gradually changed over time. Luke made one final walk through the room, adjusting labels and checking that every display case was secure. Eli stood near the entrance, greeting early visitors with the quiet pride of someone watching an old promise finally kept. Hannah paused beside the doorway before the first guests arrived. Just weeks earlier, the building had been dusty, nearly empty, and occupied only by a forgotten kiln. Now it felt alive again. At precisely 9 o'clock, the doors opened. The first visitors entered cautiously, speaking in hushed voices as they moved from one display to another. Several longtime residents recognized family names listed throughout the workshop register. One elderly woman stared silently at a photograph before wiping tears from her eyes. "My grandmother used to say her mother painted pottery," she whispered. "No one ever believed her." Hannah gently showed her the register where her great-grandmother's name appeared beside several decorative serving bowls. The woman touched the glass protecting the page, but never placed her hand upon it. "She was telling the truth all along," she said softly. As the morning continued, more residents arrived, Some studied the documents with genuine curiosity, while others quietly compared familiar family stories against the recovered records. Martha patiently answered questions, always pointing visitors toward the original evidence rather than offering opinions. Luke demonstrated traditional pottery techniques using modern clay so children could better understand how much skill the original artists possessed. The atmosphere gradually shifted from skepticism to thoughtful conversation. Richard Hale arrived shortly before noon. Instead of standing apart, he quietly walked through the exhibition, reading every display from beginning to end. Several people noticed him but said nothing. When he reached the correspondence bearing his father's signature, he remained there for several long moments before moving on. Hannah watched from across the room but did not interrupt him. This was no longer simply her discovery. The town itself had begun confronting its own history. During the afternoon, a volunteer announced that another visitor wished to donate something connected to the exhibition. Hannah walked toward the entrance where an elderly woman waited with a carefully wrapped bundle resting in her lap. She introduced herself as Grace Miller. "My mother told me to keep this safe until someone finally started asking the right questions," she said. Hannah helped her unwrap the bundle. Inside rested a bronze badge polished smooth by generations of careful handling. At its center appeared the familiar symbol of the clay vessel surrounded by 3 stars. Martha looked at it in amazement. "It's the workshop badge." Grace nodded. "My grandmother belonged to the Pottery group. Before she died, she gave this to my mother. She always said the real story would come back one day." Hannah gently accepted the badge. Unlike the symbol carved into the crates or pressed beneath the pottery, this version had been cast in bronze and fitted with a pin for wearing. Around the edge, tiny engraved lettering read, "Craft, Community, Truth." The words perfectly reflected everything Eleanor's letter had described. Grace smiled warmly. "It belongs here now." Hannah thanked her sincerely before placing the badge inside a new display case beside Eleanor's letter. Throughout the afternoon, more families arrived carrying photographs, handwritten recipes, faded letters, and small pieces of pottery passed quietly through generations. Many had never considered those keepsakes historically important until seeing the exhibition. Piece by piece, forgotten memories began reconnecting with documented history. Late in the day, after most visitors had left, Hannah, Luke, Martha, Eli, and Richard remained inside the workshop helping organize the unexpected donations. While moving one of the old display cabinets closer to the wall, Luke noticed that its weight shifted unevenly. He crouched beside it and tapped the wooden base. "This sounds strange." Hannah immediately recognized the familiar hollow echo. Together they carefully lifted the cabinet away from the wall. Hidden beneath the lower panel was a narrow compartment built into the cabinet itself. It had escaped notice because decades of dust had blended the seams into the surrounding wood. Luke carefully released the small wooden latch concealed beneath the molding. Inside rested a simple cedar box no larger than a family Bible. Time had darkened the wood, but the lid remained tightly closed. Resting on top was a folded sheet of paper, protected beneath thin waxed cloth. Hannah unfolded it carefully. Written in Eleanor Brooks's unmistakable handwriting were only a few words. "For the one who completes the record." No one spoke. Hannah slowly lifted the cedar box from its hidden compartment. It felt surprisingly light. There was no lock, only a small brass clasp worn smooth with age. She looked around the room at the people who had helped uncover the story from the very beginning. Martha quietly smiled. Luke nodded encouragingly. Eli removed his hat once again, just as he had when they first opened the crate beneath the kiln. Richard stood silently near the doorway, waiting without expectation. Hannah rested her fingers upon the worn brass clasp, took one steady breath, and slowly began to open the final box Eleanor Brooks had left behind. Hannah released the worn brass clasp and slowly lifted the lid of the cedar box. A faint scent of aged wood drifted into the quiet workshop as everyone gathered closer. Unlike the crates hidden beneath the kiln, this box contained only a few carefully arranged items. Resting on top was a folded parchment tied with blue ribbon. Beneath it lay a leather-bound booklet bearing the familiar symbol of the clay vessel surrounded by 3 stars, followed by a neatly written register of names. Every document had been wrapped in linen to protect it from moisture and time. Hannah carefully untied the ribbon and unfolded the parchment. Across the top, written in elegant script, appeared the title, Charter of the Red Hollow Pioneer Pottery Workshop. Martha's eyes widened. The original charter? Hannah began reading aloud. The charter explained that the workshop had been founded not simply to produce pottery, but to create opportunity for families settling the region. It declared that every artisan deserved equal recognition for honest work, regardless of wealth, position, or gender. Decisions would be shared. Skills would be taught freely to apprentices willing to learn. Success would belong to the community rather than to any single individual. Every signature at the bottom belonged to one of the women whose names had slowly disappeared from the official record. Eleanor Brooks signed first, followed by the artists whose work now surrounded them inside the exhibition. Luke looked quietly across the display room. They wrote the future they hoped for. Hannah gently placed the charter beside the workshop register before opening the leather booklet underneath. It proved to be a complete catalog of every pottery piece created during the workshop's earliest years. Each object was listed beside the name of its maker, the date it had been fired, and short notes describing its purpose. Some had been crafted for local families beginning new farms. Others supplied schools, churches, and neighboring settlements. Many had never been intended as expensive works of art. They had been created to serve ordinary people while quietly reflecting extraordinary craftsmanship. Beneath the catalog rested one final document. The paper had yellowed more than any of the others, and the handwriting immediately felt familiar. Hannah smiled softly before anyone spoke. "It's Eleanor." She unfolded the letter carefully. "To the person who finally completes this record," she began reading. "If these pages have reached your hands, then our work has survived longer than we ever expected. We did not hide these records because we believe our pottery was priceless. We hid them because truth sometimes requires patience when people are unwilling to receive it. We accepted that others might receive credit during our own lifetime if it meant the work itself would endure. Clay survives fire because it is willing to change. People often become stronger for the same reason." Hannah paused briefly before continuing. Eleanor wrote that recognition had never been her greatest wish. What mattered most was ensuring that future generations understood who had shaped the community through steady hands and quiet perseverance. "Do not restore only our names," the letter continued. "Restore the habit of giving credit where it has always belonged. Let every child who studies these records know that history becomes stronger when every honest voice is allowed to remain within it." By the time Hannah reached the final paragraph, her own voice had grown unsteady. Eleanor ended with a simple request. "If our workshop ever lives again, let it become a place where neighbors gather, learn, create, and remember together." That would be the finest monument any artist could hope to leave behind. Silence settled gently across the room after Hannah folded the letter. No one hurried to speak. The documents had answered every question the hidden kiln had first raised. The collection had never been hidden for wealth. It had been preserved so that the complete story could one day be told with honesty. Richard Hale slowly stepped forward. His eyes remained fixed upon the charter resting on the table. "My father believed protecting the exhibition was enough," he said quietly. He was wrong. And I was wrong to let that version of history continue after I learned there were unanswered questions. He turned toward Hannah. Martha, Luke, Eli, and the visitors who still remained inside the workshop. On behalf of my family, I offer my sincere apology to the descendants of every artist whose work was displayed without proper recognition. We cannot change what happened, but we can help correct the record now. No one applauded. The moment felt too personal for celebration. Instead, several visitors nodded quietly. Grace Miller stepped forward and gently placed the bronze workshop badge beside the original charter. "I think they'd be satisfied with that," she whispered. Over the following weeks, the exhibition expanded into something much larger than anyone had expected. The town council unanimously approved updating Red Hollow's official historical displays using the recovered documents as their primary source. Martha supervised the preservation of the original records while copies were prepared for schools, libraries, and researchers. Richard fulfilled his promise by helping fund professional conservation without attempting to control the project. Eli donated additional antiques connected to the town's early pottery tradition. Luke volunteered countless hours restoring equipment so visitors could better understand the craft that had built the community. Hannah remained at the center of it all, though she rarely thought of herself as the person responsible. She simply felt grateful that Eleanor and the other artists had trusted someone, someday, to finish what they could not. Several months later, the workshop officially reopened under a new name chosen by unanimous agreement from the town: the Red Hollow Pioneer Pottery Workshop and Community Studio. The restored kiln Hannah had purchased for only $300 stood proudly near the entrance beside the original charter and photographs of the women whose names had finally returned to history. Visitors explored the museum galleries before joining pottery classes held in the adjoining studio, where children and grandparents worked side by side, shaping fresh clay with patient hands. Laughter gradually replaced the silence that had filled the abandoned building when Hannah first arrived. One quiet evening after the final visitors had gone home, Hannah and Luke stood outside watching warm light spill through the workshop windows. The bronze sign above the entrance reflected the fading sunset. Luke smiled. "Hard to believe this all started because you bought an old kiln everyone else ignored." Hannah laughed softly. "I thought I was buying a chance to begin again." She looked through the open doorway where the restored pottery, Eleanor's letter, and the original charter rested safely inside. Instead, I found people who had been waiting much longer than I had. She remembered standing alone in her empty art gallery months earlier, convinced that losing everything meant losing herself. Now she understood that endings sometimes clear space for purposes we never expect. She had arrived in Red Hollow carrying failure. She remained because she had discovered belonging. The forgotten kiln had never been the true treasure. The real inheritance had been the courage of women who trusted that kindness, patience, and truth could outlast silence. As the evening lights glowed warmly inside the workshop, and the first new generation of artists prepared to continue the tradition Eleanor Brooks had once protected, Hannah realized that some collections are measured not by their value, but by the lives they inspire long after the clay has cooled. Sometimes the greatest treasures are not hidden because they are made of gold or worth a fortune, but because they carry the truth that someone hoped would survive until the world was finally ready to hear it. Hannah's journey reminds us that failure is not always the end of our story. It can become the beginning of a purpose we never imagined. The voices of honest, hard-working people may be forgotten for a season, but truth has a remarkable way of finding those willing to search with patience, humility, and compassion. In the end, the most valuable legacy we can leave behind is not fame or wealth, but the courage to give others the credit they deserve, to preserve history with honesty, and to build communities where every person's contribution is remembered. like clay shaped by careful hands and strengthened through fire. Our greatest trials can become the very things that give our lives lasting meaning.